Monster Reunion. You have no idea how much I've been looking forward to this episode. And despite some adverse feelings that I had towards the early leaks that came out regarding this episode, I can happily say, right out the gate, that this episode did not disappoint. Of course, as per usual, there will be spoilers for the episode in this review, so if you haven't seen it and you don't want to be spoiled, I suggest that you go watch it now. This is a big deal kind of episode. But for those of you who haven't seen it and just don't care, or those of you who need a little bit of recap, here's how this episode went down. Steven, realizing that his healing powers have returned, suggests to Garnet that he try his healing powers on one of the corrupted gems. She tells him no. Of course, we already know that Rose tried to heal the corrupted gems herself, and practically speaking, her healing powers aren't any different than Steven's, aside from the fact that Steven's powers come in the form of healing saliva, whereas hers came in the form of healing tears. Combine that with the fact that we are flat out told that Garnet is using her future vision in this instance, we can be fairly certain that regardless of how hard Steven tries, he's not going to be able to fully heal whichever corrupted gem he tries to fix. However, Steven stares her down, and as Garnet puts it later, he defeats her in a battle of wills, and she allows him to at least try. And a little bit of a side note here, we do know for a fact, because she was using her future vision to look into this situation, that she had to have known that this was at least a possibility. What is going to happen next was at least a possibility. Of course, Steven decides to try to heal the centipedal first, since he has such a bond with it, and even though his healing spit only brings her about half back to her original form, Steven insists that it has worked, which really says volumes about how accepting Steven is of other people, that he would think that a gem who still has such monstrous features is a person. But he soon discovers that Centipedal still doesn't seem to be able to quite understand him and can't communicate with him, can't speak, and comes to the realization that it hasn't worked after all. But while the other crystal gems seem to think that the best course of action at this point is to bubble Centipedal again so that she can, as they put it, rest, Steven insists that he has to try to help her further. If his healing spit doesn't work, then he'll just spend time with her like he did last time. After learning that she can't write, they sit down with some paper and crayons and eventually hammer out a means of communication through images. And it is in this way that Centipedal tells Steven her backstory, how she was a homeworld gem, captain of a homeworld ship, who was left behind in the evacuation of Earth and corrupted by an attack from the diamonds. We now know definitively that it was the diamonds themselves that caused the corruption of the corrupted gems. As they communicate more and more, Centipedal seems to begin to remember more and more about her past until finally she seems desperate to get somewhere. Even as her body starts to revert back to that of the Centipedal mother, she tries to warp to a different location. But the fact that she is corrupted means that she can't use the warp pad. Understanding that she's trying to get to one of the gem ships, Steven teleports her there, manages to get her inside, and helps her to reunite with her crew, which stayed behind, waiting for her and got corrupted themselves. The other gems agree that because it makes her happy, Centipedal can live there with them from now on. I don't even have words to describe the impact that this episode had. Not only was it just as deep and emotional as Monster Buddies, not only did it have a similar emotional impact as that episode, it also had a huge impact on the lore. In fact, I actually have a list. It's been a while since I've had to do this, but I have a list of talking points that I need to go over. That's just how much is crammed into this one episode. First of all, it's important to point out that when she half regenerates back into her humanoid form, Centipedal is wearing a different colored variation of the spacesuit that we have sometimes seen Pearl wear, implying that gems that are specifically assigned to ships wear those spacesuits. Just thought that was a fantastic continuity nod. We also get a definitive description for exactly what kind of damage corruption is. Garnet specifically likens it to damage to the mind. That proves, once and for all, that corrupted gems are brain damaged. Also, through dialogue from the gems, it's heavily implied that Rose was able to bring some corrupted gems almost as far back to their humanoid forms as Steven is able to get Centipedal in this episode, but that she was never able to bring them back further, and that they always reverted back like Centipedal does at the end. Which actually brings me to why the promos for this episode had me worried. I was worried that Steven would just suddenly be able to heal Centipedal completely with his healing spit, completely disregarding all of the heavy implications within the lore that simply isn't possible, that something more would have to be done. Thankfully, this episode did keep to the lore and confirmed a lot of things that have been implied for a very long time. It's also very important to note that when Senti is drawing the evacuation of Earth and the subsequent diamond attack, the corruption attack, Steven recognizes that she is trying to visualize, he calls it music, I believe, or a song or something along those lines, as well as a flash of light. This actually fits with the depiction of the flash of light that we saw in Same Old World in Lapis's flashback, which was accompanied by some of the scores associated so far with the diamonds, and suggests heavily that it was an audio-visual frequency which caused the corruption of the gems, and that it may take knowledge of audio-visual frequencies to uncorrupt them and bring them back. Also keep in mind that Rose's shield was able to protect against either the audio frequency, the visual frequency, or both, and save the few crystal gems that are still alive uncorrupted on the planet. And because it was able to do so once, it can do so again. It's also becoming more and more apparent that the decision that the Diamonds made to evacuate the Earth and unleash whatever this corruption attack was something of a split-second decision, since they called for the evacuation of their people, but didn't actually give all of them enough time to leave. It's also pretty interesting that it's obvious in this episode that Centipedal understands that the Diamonds could have waited, and no longer seems to have any loyalty to them for that reason. At the end of this episode, we also get in-series confirmation of the gem written language. It turns out that when Centipedal tried to write a message to Steven before she drew one to him, her scribbles were actually gem writing. Gem writing has been acknowledged in the series, and it's implied that Steven is going to try to get Pearl to teach it to him. That's incredibly exciting. We've seen gem writing in various scenes all throughout the series. I would love to know what that writing says. Also, I find it interesting that Amethyst didn't seem confused by gem writing or the notion of gem writing, which means that either she just didn't care, she's been taught gem writing by one of the crystal gems, or it's something that is pre-programmed into gems before they're even born. And finally, and in some ways the most interesting of these little talking points, is the fact that compared directly to Monster Buddies, we finally have an almost shot-for-shot comparison between the behavior of the gems then and the behavior of the gems now, showing how far they have come in trusting Steven. You can go back and rewatch Monster Buddies and make note of all of the gems' reactions, and then watch Monster Reunion and compare how they react here to see without a shadow of a doubt how much more faith they have in Steven now than they used to. Also, just a very quick reminder that Centipedal's crew cared enough about her that they waited on Earth and got corrupted just so they wouldn't leave her behind. These are good people. I definitely hope that once Steven is able to help Centipedal more, he's able to help her crew as well. And there's probably more that I'm leaving out. This episode was so jam-packed full of stuff that there's probably stuff in here that I haven't even picked out yet. And yet this episode had none of the issues with pacing that some of the recent episodes have had, which is great news for the series going forward. And honestly, this episode had some of the most consistent characterization for any of the main characters that I've ever seen in the show. They were very clearly acting directly based upon things that had occurred in their past. Not to say that that doesn't happen a lot, it was just particularly noticeable here and very welcome. That's some very good writing. I do, once the Steven Summer Adventure event is over, plan to go and update several of my theories with theory update videos, and there is definitely going to be some stuff from this episode that makes it into those. I've also pushed back and rearranged several of my pre-existing theory ideas so that I can post a theory about this episode this Monday. That's how big an impact it left on me. I just have to talk about it that much. There have been some very good episodes so far during the Steven Summer Adventure event, but this one is the standout episode. At least so far. But guys, if you have seen this episode, what do you think of it? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.
You remember we were buds.